Some families are remembered for their legacy, others for their sins. In 1858, Massachusetts, the Putnam family appeared to be the very image of wealth, power, and respectability. But behind the grand house and polished reputation hid a world of deceit, cruelty, and madness that the town would whisper about for generations. What the Putnams buried beneath their perfect image was darker than anyone could imagine, and once uncovered, it destroyed everything they stood for. Before we open the doors to their twisted world, tell me, where are you watching from? And make sure to subscribe, because every story I bring you is built on hours of real historical research, rare documents, and the forgotten truths no one else dares to tell. The Putnam family's rise to prominence in Massachusetts was the product of wealth, power, and an unrelenting desire to be seen as untouchable. By 1858, their name was spoken with both admiration and envy across the region. The family patriarch, Jonathan Putnam, was a man of immense influence, a shrewd businessman whose dealings stretched from the lumber trade to the booming textile industry. His home, a towering white mansion that overlooked the town of Danvers, was more than just a symbol of prosperity. It was a statement of dominance. The Putnams were not just another wealthy family. They were the kind of people others feared to cross, because their reach extended into politics, business, and even the local church. From the outside, the Putnams represented everything respectable about New England society. They hosted lavish dinners, donated generously to the parish, and presented themselves as the moral backbone of the community. Their children were well-dressed, well-educated, and well-behaved, or so it seemed. Servants maintained the grounds meticulously, and every portrait hanging in the main hall told a story of lineage, pride, and power. Yet beneath the surface of their success, something darker was beginning to take root, a decay of spirit masked by polished smiles and carefully chosen words. Jonathan's wife, Eleanor Putnam, was equally admired and feared. Known for her strict demeanor and cold beauty, she ruled the household with an iron will. Behind closed doors, she demanded obedience not just from her servants, but from her children as well. Every aspect of their lives was controlled. The way they dressed, the words they spoke, even the way they interacted with one another. Mistakes were not tolerated. Emotions were signs of weakness. To the outside world, Eleanor was a model of refinement. Inside the Putnam mansion, she was a woman obsessed with appearances and terrified of imperfection. The family's children, 3 sons and 2 daughters, were raised under this suffocating atmosphere of expectation. The eldest, Thomas, was being groomed to inherit the business empire, though he reportedly suffered from severe mood swings and fits of rage. His younger brother, Edward, was more withdrawn, quiet to the point of unsettling. The townspeople often whispered that he seemed haunted, as if carrying a secret too heavy for his years. The daughters, Catherine and Eliza, were admired for their grace, but both were said to be fragile, often ill, and kept hidden away from visitors for reasons the family never explained. Despite the cracks forming within their walls, the Putnams maintained their image flawlessly. When rumors began to circulate about strange happenings on their estate, unexplained noises, servants leaving without notice, and family members seen wandering the grounds late at night, the Putnams dismissed them as gossip born of jealousy. And perhaps that was true for a time. But the truth was, the pressure of maintaining perfection was beginning to erode the family from within. Secrets began to fester. Alliances formed and shattered, and resentment seeped into the bloodline like poison. By 1858, the Putnams were at the height of their influence, but the foundations of their dynasty were already cracking. The wealth that had built their empire came with moral compromises that no one dared to speak of publicly. Business partners disappeared under mysterious circumstances, competitors met sudden ruin, and whispers suggested the family's success was built on more than just hard work. It was built on manipulation, deceit, and perhaps even blood. The people of Massachusetts still smiled when they passed the Putnam estate, but they did so with unease, as if they knew that behind those tall white walls something deeply unnatural was watching, waiting, and slowly unraveling. The rise of the Putnam family was not just a tale of ambition, it was the beginning of a tragedy. Their power shielded them for years, but it also isolated them, trapping them in a web of secrets that would soon begin to rot from the inside. What started as a story of success and social prestige would soon transform into one of madness, betrayal, and darkness that no amount of wealth could ever contain. The strange behavior of the Putnam family began so subtly that few noticed it at first. To the townspeople of Danvers, the family still appeared composed and dignified. But behind the mansion's elegant facade, unease was growing like mold in the walls. Servants whispered that the family had changed, that laughter had vanished from the halls, replaced by uneasy silences and sudden fits of temper. Visitors spoke of feeling unwelcome in the grand house, as though the air itself carried tension. What had once been a home of refinement was turning into something darker, a place where something unseen was taking hold of the minds that lived within. It started with Thomas, the eldest son. Groomed to inherit his father's empire, Thomas had always been proud, driven, and a little ruthless. But sometime around the spring of 1858, he began to unravel. Servants claimed he spent hours alone in his study, muttering to himself, pacing endlessly until dawn. One maid swore she saw him speaking to a figure that wasn't there, his face pale and drenched in sweat. When questioned, Thomas dismissed it as exhaustion, yet his temper grew erratic. He would erupt in anger over the smallest things, an unpolished boot, a misplaced letter, and then retreat into guilt-ridden silence for days. Some said he was haunted by guilt over the family business, that he had done something terrible on his father's orders. Others whispered that madness ran in the bloodline. His younger brother Edward's behavior was even more unsettling. Once a quiet, thoughtful young man, Edward began to withdraw completely, refusing to eat with the family and spending long hours in the attic. The servants who brought him food said he kept journals filled with strange symbols and phrases written in Latin, though none could read enough to understand them. He claimed he was studying the voices in the walls, and one night he was heard chanting in the dark. The next morning he was calm again, eerily calm, as if the outburst had never happened. The family doctor attributed it to nerves, but privately confessed that Edward's eyes frightened him. Eleanor Putnam, the matriarch, tried to keep control of appearances, but even she was not immune to the growing tension. Once composed and commanding, she became paranoid, insisting the servants were plotting against her. She dismissed several without explanation and forbade anyone from entering certain parts of the house, especially after sunset. Guests noticed she had begun locking doors behind her and sleeping with candles burning through the night. When neighbors came calling, she greeted them with her usual poise, but seemed distracted, her gaze darting toward the staircases as if listening for something unseen. The daughters, Catherine and Eliza, added another layer to the unease. Both were described as gentle, delicate girls, but by the summer of that year they had become distant and strange. Catherine stopped speaking altogether for several weeks, communicating only through written notes. Eliza was often seen wandering barefoot in the garden at odd hours, murmuring the same phrase again and again, "The house remembers." When I stood to, Eleanor tried to discipline her. Eliza fought back with a violence no one thought possible of her. The family priest was called to bless the home, but after his visit he never returned, claiming he had fallen ill. By autumn, the townspeople had begun to talk. Some said the Putnams were cursed, others that madness had taken root in their bloodline. The family began to isolate themselves completely, declining social invitations and turning away guests at the gate. their grand home became a fortress of secrecy, its windows often dark, its halls echoing with strange sounds that travelers on the nearby road swore they could hear at night. Jonathan Putnam, the patriarch, seemed the only one unaffected, or perhaps he simply hid it better. He continued his business dealings, smiling confidently in public, but even he began to show cracks. He was seen arguing with himself in his carriage, shouting names no one recognized. Some claimed to have seen him walking through the cemetery behind the estate at midnight, carrying a lantern and whispering under his breath. When confronted, he laughed it off as imagination, but the laughter didn't reach his eyes. What once looked like a family of grace and power had become a collection of haunted souls, bound together by secrets they refused to speak aloud. Whether it was guilt, madness, or something far more sinister, the Putnams were no longer the people their town had admired. The strange behavior spreading through their bloodline wasn't random. It was connected, as if the families buried. Sins were clawing their way to the surface, demanding to be seen. The mysterious illness that struck the Putnam household arrived quietly, like a shadow creeping in through the cracks. It began with small signs, pale faces, trembling hands, sleepless nights, and soon grew into something that no doctor could explain. By the winter of 1858, nearly every member of the Putnam family was afflicted in one way or another, yet each showed different symptoms. Some suffered from violent fevers that came and went without pattern. Others claimed to hear whispering voices calling their names when no one was around. What made the illness truly strange was not just its unpredictability, but the fear that seemed to follow it. Servants spoke of a feeling in the air, thick, heavy, and cold, that made the entire house feel alive, as if it were breathing with them. It started with Eleanor Putnam, the matriarch. One morning, she was found collapsed on the floor of her room, her skin clammy and her pulse weak. She regained consciousness hours later, confused and trembling, insisting that she had seen someone standing at the foot of her bed, a young woman with hollow eyes and a blood-stained dress. When the servants searched the room, they found nothing. Eleanor became hysterical, claiming that the figure had whispered, "It's your turn." After that night, she refused to sleep without the lamps burning and began drinking laudanum to calm her nerves. But the visions didn't stop. They grew more vivid. She would wake screaming, clawing at the sheets, as if someone were trying to pull her away. Soon after, Thomas Putnam fell ill. He was plagued by violent headaches and a constant sense of dread. He complained of seeing dark shapes moving in his peripheral vision, and his temper grew worse by the day. On one occasion, he destroyed the family's dining table in a fit of rage, shouting that the food was poisoned. His behavior frightened even his father, Jonathan, who insisted on bringing in the town physician. But the doctor could find no physical cause. He suggested rest and prayer, though his face betrayed unease. Before leaving, he told the butler quietly that he had never seen eyes like Thomas's, as if they were looking at something none of us could see. Edward's condition took a more disturbing turn. He began losing weight rapidly, claiming that he couldn't eat because the food smelled like iron. At night, he muttered to himself, saying he was being punished for the family's sins. He accused his father of inviting something evil into the home, something that feeds on guilt. One morning, the servants found strange markings carved into the wooden floor of his room, circles, symbols and words in Latin that no one could translate. Edward swore he didn't make them, that they appeared overnight, but his fingers were raw and bloodied, as though he had been scratching the wood in his sleep. Even the youngest members of the family weren't spared. Eliza, the youngest daughter, developed a fever so intense that she began speaking in voices not her own, sometimes in the tone of an old woman, sometimes in whispers that made the servants cross themselves. Catherine, her older sister, claimed that Eliza's eyes turned black during these episodes, though others dismissed it as hysteria. Still, the fear spread through the household like wildfire. One servant, a woman named Ruth, quit abruptly after finding her rosary beads melted into a lump beside her bed. She told others in the village that the house itself is sick, and that whatever ailed the Putnams was not of this world. Desperate for answers, Jonathan Putnam brought in a specialist from Boston, Dr. Harold Fenwick, known for studying nervous conditions. Fenwick examined each member of the family and concluded that it was a form of collective hysteria, likely brought on by a shared trauma or hidden guilt. He prescribed isolation, rest, and a strict schedule of tonics and purges. But the treatment only seemed to make things worse. Within days, Eleanor suffered a breakdown and began tearing down the curtains, shouting that they're watching from behind the fabric. Dr. Fenwick left abruptly the next morning and never returned to the estate. By the end of that winter, the Putnam mansion had become a house of silence and dread. The family no longer ate together. Meals were brought to their separate rooms, though half were left untouched. Servants tiptoed through the halls, afraid to make noise. The illness had taken something from them all: sleep, appetite, sanity, and replaced it with a growing terror that no medicine could touch. Some claimed it was a curse, a punishment for sins buried in the family's past. Others believed it was a contagion, a disease of the mind spreading through generations. But there were a few who whispered something even darker, that the Putnams weren't sick at all, but being consumed, that what lived in their home wasn't a ghost or a fever, but the physical form of their guilt, feeding on every secret, every lie, every drop of hidden cruelty passed down through their blood. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: the illness was no longer just inside their bodies. It was in the walls, in the air, and in the very foundation of the Putnam name. The forbidden relationships that fractured the Putnam family began long before the tragedy of 1858. But that year brought everything to light in the most destructive way imaginable. Beneath the appearance of refinement and moral virtue, the family hid desires, betrayals, and obsessions that no one dared speak of publicly. In the quiet halls of the Putnam mansion, love and loyalty had twisted into something darker, a chain of secret attachments that corroded trust and poisoned bloodlines. What began as whispers between servants soon became undeniable, as the boundaries that separated family, class, and decency began to blur within the walls of that cursed home. At the center of the scandal was Thomas Putnam, the eldest son. From an early age he had been taught that family name meant everything, that desire was a weakness, and that love should serve only to strengthen their lineage. But Thomas's heart had never obeyed those rules. He had fallen deeply in love with Clara, a housemaid brought in from a nearby village when he was 20. The relationship began quietly: small gestures, lingering looks, shared words in the dimly lit hallways. But soon it grew into a passionate secret, one that defied every expectation of the family's strict hierarchy. When Eleanor, the matriarch, discovered the affair, she was furious. She dismissed Clara immediately, sending her away without a single coin of compensation, and threatened Thomas with disinheritance if he ever spoke to her again. But Thomas didn't listen. He continued to see Clara in secret, sneaking out at night to meet her by the riverbank beyond the family's land. The affair went on for months, and in time Clara became pregnant. When Thomas learned of it, he promised to protect her, but fear overcame him. He knew that if his father discovered the truth, both he and Clara would be ruined. Clara disappeared not long after. Some said she was sent away quietly. Others believed something far worse. A week later, her body was found near the river, cold and lifeless. The death was ruled an accident, but locals whispered that the Putnams had made sure her silence was permanent. After that, Thomas changed completely. He withdrew from the world, tormented by guilt, convinced that his family had blood on their hands, and so did he. But the family's forbidden entanglements didn't end there. Edward Putnam, the younger brother, carried a secret of his own, one that was even more scandalous. He had developed an obsessive attachment to his cousin Margaret Putnam, a woman as intelligent as she was unstable. Their correspondence, discovered years later in the attic, revealed a love that defied both moral and familial bounds. Margaret wrote of visions she had while dreaming, visions of fire, of blood, of a union that cannot be undone. Edward's letters grew more desperate over time, filled with fear that their love was cursed, that they were repeating some ancestral sin. When Margaret married another man, Edward became reclusive, falling deeper into despair and madness. Some said he tried to summon her spirit after she died, performing strange rituals in the attic that left scorch marks on the floorboards. Even Jonathan Putnam, the family patriarch, was not without guilt. For years, rumors had circulated that he kept a companion in Boston, a young widow who depended on his financial support. While he denied it publicly, servants often overheard heated arguments between him and Eleanor about the woman and her child. The suggestion that Jonathan might have fathered a child outside the marriage infuriated Eleanor, who had long endured his coldness and control. Their relationship decayed into bitterness, and some claimed that Eleanor began seeking solace elsewhere, in the company of the family's doctor, a man far too comfortable with his frequent visits. Whether that rumor was true or not, it fueled Jonathan's paranoia and deepened the cracks in the family's unity. As these secrets unfolded, the household atmosphere grew unbearable. The once proud Putnams became prisoners of their own guilt and suspicion. They could no longer trust each other, yet couldn't escape the bonds of their name. Every meal was silent, every glance heavy with unspoken accusations. Thomas blamed his father for Clara's death. Eleanor blamed Thomas for shaming the family. Edward blamed himself for loving Margaret. And Jonathan, the supposed head of the house, found his authority rotting under the weight of their hidden sins. The servants, once loyal, began to fear the family. They said the mansion itself seemed to reflect the corruption within. Mirrors cracking without cause, portraits falling from the walls, rooms growing inexplicably cold. One maid claimed to have seen Clara's reflection in a window, staring back with lifeless eyes. Another swore she heard voices whispering from the locked attic, calling Edward's name. The forbidden relationships had not only torn the family apart, they had awakened something that fed on their shame and secrecy. By the time winter arrived, the Putnams were bound together by silence and guilt, their bloodline poisoned by the sins they tried to hide. The forbidden desires that once brought them comfort had become chains dragging them toward ruin. And though they tried to bury the past beneath their wealth and influence, the past was not done with them. The echoes of those loves and betrayals would haunt the family for generations, whispering through the halls of their crumbling home, reminding all who dared to listen that the Putnams' curse began not with madness, but with forbidden love. The night that shattered the illusion of the Putnams' perfect life began like any other, quiet, cold, and heavy with the stillness that had come to define their mansion. Outside, the Massachusetts wind howled through the barren trees, but inside the family dined together in uneasy silence. No one spoke much anymore. Conversations had long turned into glares and half-finished sentences. Yet on that particular evening, there was a tension in the air unlike anything before. It was as if the house itself sensed what was coming. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of candlelight seemed to pulse with dread. Jonathan Putnam, the patriarch, sat at the head of the table, his face stern, his hands clasped tightly. Across from him, Eleanor picked at her food, refusing to meet his eyes. Thomas sat beside her, silent and pale, while Edward's gaze drifted toward the window, lost in thoughts no one dared ask about. The daughters, Catherine and Eliza, exchanged wary looks. They all felt it, the air too thick, the silence too deep. Something was going to happen. It began with a sound, a faint knocking from upstairs. At first they ignored it. The old mansion was full of noises, after all. But the knocking grew louder, rhythmic, deliberate. Eleanor froze, her fork halfway to her lips. Thomas stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "It's the wind," Jonathan muttered, but his voice trembled. The knocking stopped, only to be replaced by the unmistakable sound of footsteps above them, slow, heavy, pacing back and forth. The attic. No one was supposed to be up there. Thomas was the first to move. He grabbed a candle and made his way toward the staircase, each step echoing through the silent house. Edward followed against his father's orders. The rest of the family waited below, straining to hear. The footsteps above had stopped, replaced by a low, dragging sound. When Thomas reached the top of the stairs, he called out, but before anyone could answer, there was a crash, a scream, and then silence. Jonathan rushed up after them, his candlelight flickering wildly as he ascended. When he reached the attic, he found the door ajar, the air freezing cold. Inside, Thomas was on the floor, blood running down his temple, and Edward stood beside him, staring at the far wall. "It's her," Edward whispered. "She's here." Jonathan followed his gaze and saw what appeared to be a shadow moving along the wall, twisting, shifting, almost human in shape. It vanished in an instant, but the damage was done. They carried Thomas back down, unconscious but alive. Eleanor was hysterical, demanding to know what had happened. Jonathan tried to calm her, but before he could speak, Edward began laughing, softly at first, then louder, until it echoed through the house. He screamed that the family was cursed, that their sins had come for them. He shouted Clara's name, accusing his father of murder. Then he turned on Eleanor, calling her the one who welcomed death into the house. The servants tried to restrain him, but he fought like a man possessed, his strength unnatural. His words disjointed and wild. That night spiraled into chaos. The storm outside grew violent, wind battering the shutters as thunder rolled over the hills. Somewhere upstairs, glass shattered. The candles flickered out, plunging the mansion into darkness. Eleanor collapsed to her knees, clutching her chest, whispering prayers. Eliza began to scream that someone was in her room. Jonathan barked orders, but his voice was drowned by the storm, and by the sound of something moving in the walls, scraping, clawing. When morning came, the house was silent again. The servants, terrified, refused to enter. Those who did found the dining room in disarray, chairs overturned, the floor stained with blood. Thomas was dead, his throat cut, though the weapon was never found. Edward was gone, vanished into the night, leaving only his journal behind, pages filled with frantic writing about sins that live and shadows that remember. Eleanor was discovered in her room, incoherent, whispering that she had seen Clara standing at the foot of her bed, smiling. Jonathan sat motionless in his study, staring at nothing, his mind clearly broken. The authorities ruled the events a tragedy, a violent family dispute that ended in death and madness. But those who came to the house afterward said otherwise. They claimed the air inside felt wrong, thick and cold, as if something still lingered there. One investigator swore that when he entered the attic, he heard a woman's voice whisper his name. Another refused to return after seeing handprints appear on the dusty mirror before his eyes. In the weeks that followed, the surviving Putnams left the estate, abandoning everything. The mansion stood empty, its windows dark, its doors locked. Locals began calling it the house that remembers, claiming that on stormy nights screams could still be heard echoing from within. Some even said they saw a young woman in white, standing at the upper window watching. The night of the tragedy marked the end of the Putnam family's reign and the beginning of their legend. What truly happened remains buried beneath layers of secrecy and fear. Some say madness consumed them. Others insist it was something else, something they had invited into their lives through lies, guilt, and forbidden love. Whatever the truth, that night revealed what had always been hiding behind their polished image, not wealth, not power, but rot. A darkness that began in their blood and finally claimed them all. The investigation that followed the Putnam tragedy was unlike anything the small Massachusetts town had ever witnessed. In the winter of 1858, the family's grand mansion became a scene of horror and fascination. What had once been a symbol of wealth and refinement now stood draped in silence and decay. The townspeople gathered beyond the gates, whispering about the screams that had echoed through the storm that night, the bodies found in disarray, and the heir who had vanished without a trace. When the local constable, William Thorne, arrived to lead the inquiry, he found himself stepping into a place that felt more like a tomb than a home. From the very beginning, nothing about the scene made sense. The dining room, where the family had gathered before the chaos, was frozen in disarray. The long oak table was overturned, chairs splintered, and shards of porcelain lay scattered across the floor. Thomas Putnam's body had been found slumped beside the hearth, his throat cut cleanly, with no weapon in sight. His blood had soaked into the floorboards, forming strange streaks that looked less like splatters and more like deliberate markings. The coroner, after examining the wound, said it was too precise for a struggle, suggesting either suicide or a killer who knew exactly what he was doing. But the absence of a blade and the fact that Thomas's hands bore no defensive wounds deepened the mystery. Jonathan Putnam, the patriarch, sat in his study when Thorne arrived, alive but barely coherent. His once imposing presence had withered into frailty. He muttered incoherently about sins returning to the house and voices from the attic. The constable noted that his fingernails were torn, as though he had clawed at the walls. In his notebook, Thorne wrote that Jonathan seemed more terrified than guilty. Eleanor, the matriarch, was found confined to her room, trembling and pale. She refused to answer questions directly, insisting over and over that she came back and the family debt has been paid. When Thorne pressed her on who she was, Eleanor grew hysterical, screaming until the doctor sedated her. Edward Putnam remained missing. His room offered the only tangible clues: a stack of journals, dozens of pages filled with erratic handwriting, strange symbols, and cryptic references to guilt, shadows, and blood. Thorne spent hours reading through them, only to find a disturbing pattern. Edward had documented the family's descent into madness, detailing his belief that their illness was not of the flesh, but of the soul. One entry, written the night before the tragedy, read, "She waits for the one who confessed nothing. She will not leave until the truth is given." Below it was a drawing of a woman's face, eyes hollow, mouth open, as if screaming. Thorne's investigation revealed something else: letters hidden behind the false back of a drawer in Jonathan's desk. They were from a woman named Clara Hensley, dated years earlier, addressed to Thomas. The letters spoke of love, fear, and betrayal. The last one, written shortly before her death, read, "He says it must be done, that we are a stain upon the family name. If I disappear, you will know who did it." The implication was clear. Clara had not died by accident. Jonathan, desperate to protect the family's reputation, had likely arranged her death. Thorne believed that when Edward and Thomas discovered the truth, it tore the family apart and may have led to murder. Yet the case grew stranger still. Servants who had fled the house after the tragedy were questioned. One described seeing a woman in white walking through the halls hours before the storm began. Another claimed that the mirrors in the upstairs corridor had all shattered at once just before Thomas's death. Most disturbing of all, a maid swore that she saw Edward speaking to someone in the attic days earlier, a shadow that seemed to move independently of the candlelight. Thorne dismissed these accounts as superstition, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the mansion itself was hiding something. When he returned a week later to re-examine the attic, he found it empty, except for a faint scent of smoke and a charred mark on the floor shaped like a circle. In the center lay a small pile of ashes and a single piece of parchment, half burned, with words scrawled across it, "The blood remembers." The handwriting matched Edward's. Whether it was part of some ritual or a final message, no one could say. The official report closed the case as a family tragedy driven by madness and guilt. Jonathan Putnam was declared unfit for questioning and committed to an asylum, where he died months later. Eleanor was sent to live with distant relatives, never speaking of that night again. Edward was never found. though some claimed to see him wandering near the river at dusk, murmuring to himself. The mansion was sealed, its doors locked, and no one dared enter for years. But Constable Thorne never forgot what he saw or heard. In his private journal found decades later, he wrote that on his last night at the estate, as he stood in the empty hall, he heard a voice whisper his name. He turned, but no one was there. The voice spoke again, this time softer, saying, "We are not gone." The investigation may have ended on paper, but in truth, it had only begun to reveal the deeper horror beneath the Putnam name. The tragedy was not just a crime of passion or madness. It was the unmasking of generations of deceit, guilt, and unconfessed sin. And for those who dared to look too closely, the house always seemed to whisper the same warning. Some secrets refused to stay buried. The shocking truth about the Putnam family's secret rituals and their obsession with control did not come to light immediately. It took years, decades even, for the details to emerge, pieced together from hidden diaries, townspeople's recollections, and the fragments of letters discovered in the crumbling estate long after the last Putnam had died. What those discoveries revealed painted a far more chilling picture than anyone could have imagined. The Putnams had not simply been victims of madness or misfortune. They had, for generations, bound themselves to dark practices, rituals rooted in superstition, guilt, and the desperate hunger to maintain power over others and over fate itself. Long before the events of 1858, the Putnam name was already heavy with whispered rumors. Their wealth, people said, had grown unnaturally fast. The family seemed to prosper even during years when other estates collapsed under debt and disease. Farmers who worked their lands spoke of strange fires burning on the hill behind the mansion on moonless nights. They said they heard chanting, low and rhythmic, and saw figures moving among the trees, their faces hidden beneath black veils. When questioned, Jonathan Putnam's father, Elias Putnam, laughed it off as nonsense. But those who had lived on the property long enough knew better. Every servant who stayed in the house for more than a year reported hearing the same thing, whispers coming from the cellar after midnight, and the smell of burnt herbs rising from beneath the floorboards. Eleanor Putnam's family journals, discovered long after her death, contained references to what she called the preservation rites. They were old prayers, she wrote, passed down through the generations. At first glance, they seemed religious, pleas for strength, health, and protection, but the wording was strange. One repeated phrase read, "The blood must remember, or the name will fade." In several entries, Eleanor described her fear that Jonathan was taking these rites too literally. He had begun holding private gatherings in the hidden chamber beneath the house, a room accessible only through the cellar door, which he kept locked at all times. Servants said he would emerge hours later with ash on his hands and a distant look in his eyes. The purpose of these rituals, it seemed, was tied to the family's obsession with control. Jonathan believed the Putnams' power, financial, social, even spiritual, depended on keeping the bloodline pure and binding it through ceremony. He spoke often of commanding fate and binding the will of fortune. According to Edward's surviving writings, Jonathan forced his sons to take part in certain rites as children, standing before the family's ancestral portrait, reciting vows of loyalty to the blood. Edward wrote that during one ceremony, his father pricked their fingers and mixed their blood with ink, then made them sign their names in a black ledger that dated back more than a century. "We are chained by our own veins," Edward had scribbled in the margins. After the tragedy, investigators discovered symbols carved into the wooden beams of the cellar, circles intersected by slanted crosses, markings eerily similar to alchemical sigils associated with protection and resurrection. Alongside them were burnt offerings, melted wax, bones of small animals, and scraps of parchment covered in Latin text. One phrase appeared repeatedly, "Sanguis regit domum," the blood rules the house. These findings were never made public at the time. Constable Thorne, fearing panic, ordered the artifacts destroyed. But a few fragments were preserved in private collections and studied decades later by historians, who confirmed their connection to occult practices common among secret societies. Of the 18th and 19th centuries, the most disturbing revelation came from a letter written by Clara Hensley, the woman whose death had haunted Thomas Putnam. In her final unsent letter, she claimed Jonathan had forced her to participate in one of the rituals after discovering her pregnancy. "He said the child could not be born unbound," she wrote. "He said, if I did not give it to the house would take it itself." Those chilling words suggested that the family's obsession with purity and power extended beyond life and death. Clara's disappearance and her later death suddenly appeared not as an act of jealousy or shame, but as a sacrifice, one meant to preserve the family's curse-bound inheritance. After Jonathan's death in the asylum, workers sent to clear out the mansion discovered a final horror. Behind a false wall in the basement, they found an altar, a crude stone slab stained dark with age, surrounded by candles and rusted metal instruments. Above it, carved into the stone itself, were the words, "The blood remembers," the same phrase found in Edward's burned parchment. The discovery confirmed what many had suspected all along. The madness that destroyed the Putnam family was not random. It was the natural consequence of decades of rituals meant to control fate, and in doing so, they had unleashed something that could no longer be controlled. Even in later years, visitors to the abandoned estate spoke of strange phenomena. Candles would blow out on their own. Cold drafts would drift through sealed rooms. Some claimed to hear chanting from the cellar at night, echoing faintly from beneath the floor. Historians who studied the family's history came to believe that the Putnams' rituals had created what they called a psychic inheritance, a curse that passed not through property or wealth, but through blood, memory, and guilt. In the end, the truth about the Putnam family was not just that they were victims of madness. It was that they tried to command powers beyond human understanding. Their need to control everything, to bind destiny itself, became the very thing that destroyed them. The rituals that promised to preserve their legacy instead consumed it, leaving behind only a house full of whispers and a name that history would never forget. In the years following the collapse of the Putnam family, the town of Salem Hollow tried to move on. The mansion was boarded up, the remaining servants left for distant towns, and the local church quietly stopped mentioning the family name in public prayers. Yet the shadow of the Putnams refused to fade. The land they owned seemed cursed. No crops grew for years, and every attempt to sell the estate ended with tragedy. Buyers would withdraw mysteriously, workers fell ill, and in one strange case, a new owner vanished entirely within weeks of moving in. The story of the Putnam family became less of a history lesson and more of a local warning, a whispered legend passed down to remind children of what happens when greed, guilt, and dark ambition intertwine. By 1890, the mansion had become a site of fascination for travelers, scholars, and the occasional thrill-seeker. Reporters from Boston wrote articles about the haunted house on Hollow Hill, claiming that strange lights could be seen flickering through the boarded windows on stormy nights. A few even claimed to have heard voices, soft, indistinct whispers, as though someone were reciting a prayer from deep within the walls. Paranormal investigators of the early 20th century found the stories irresistible. When a group of researchers entered the property in 1903, they described cold air that seemed to move like breath and a presence that followed them from room to room. One of them, a man named Henry Calden, wrote afterward that he heard a woman weeping in the cellar, and when he tried to follow the sound, the temperature dropped so sharply that his lantern cracked from the cold. Despite these terrifying encounters, the most unsettling part of the Putnam legacy was not the hauntings themselves. It was how the story continued to mirror the same darkness that had always surrounded the family. People began noticing a strange pattern. Those who tried to exploit the Putnam mansion for profit by turning it into a tourist site or selling its artifacts seemed to meet the same fate as the family that built it. In 1924, a collector who purchased one of Jonathan Putnam's books from the estate sale was found dead in his study. The book opened to a page that read, "The Blood Remembers." In 1948, a group of teenagers who broke into the house for a dare never returned. Only their lanterns were found near the cellar stairs. Police searched the entire structure, but no bodies were ever recovered. It was as if the house itself had swallowed them. The deeper historians dug into the Putnam archives, the more they realized that the family's curse might not have been merely symbolic. Edward Putnam's journals, long forgotten in a private collection, resurfaced in the 1960s. In them, Edward described his father's final moments, how Jonathan had tried to seal the bond forever by performing one last ritual. He wrote of fire, screams, and a voice that spoke from the darkness, telling Jonathan that the house would never sleep again. Edward's final line was a desperate plea: "Whoever reads this, do not enter the cellar. It belongs to the blood." In the modern era, urban explorers and paranormal documentarians have made countless attempts to film inside the ruins of the estate, but none have stayed long. In 2003, a crew from a Boston television network entered to shoot a Halloween special. Within an hour, their audio equipment began picking up static, whispers layered beneath their own voices. They described hearing faint weeping, echoing footsteps, and the unmistakable sound of someone scratching from inside the walls. The footage was never aired. The network cancelled the segment, citing technical issues, but those who worked on the project told a different story, that one crew member had been hospitalized afterward, suffering from severe psychological distress, claiming she'd seen a woman in the cellar holding a book bound in blood-red leather. Even today, the property remains untouched, fenced off by the state under the guise of preservation. Locals say that the real reason no one dares to restore it is because those who enter never leave unchanged. Travelers who have visited the ruins at night often report hearing whispers that seem to call their names. Some claim to have seen a flicker of candlelight behind the cracked windows, as though the house itself were alive, still waiting for the next soul to claim. The legend of the Putnam family has grown into something larger than history. It has become a warning about obsession, legacy, and the price of tampering with forces beyond human comprehension. The last remaining piece of the family's existence, a seal, portrait of Jonathan and Eleanor, was removed from the estate in 1989 and placed in the Salem Historical Museum. But even there, strange incidents followed. Security guards reported that the painting sometimes seemed to change expression. Eleanor's eyes would appear wet, as though crying, while Jonathan's faint smile twisted into something grim. Late at night, motion sensors near the portrait would trigger alarms, though no one was present. Eventually, the museum closed the exhibit entirely and placed the portrait in storage, labeling it simply Item 47, the Putnam family. And so, the curse continues, not in the form of monsters or visible horrors, but through the echoes of those who once believed they could master fate itself. The Putnam story endures because it reflects something deeply human: our fear of losing control, our hunger for power, and our refusal to let go of the past. In trying to bind their destiny with blood and ritual, the Putnams chained themselves to eternity. And if you listen closely, some say, on the quietest nights in Salem Hollow, you can still hear them, chanting softly from beneath the earth, guarding the secret that destroyed them all.